today's lecture, and there's going to be some in-class work as well. Anything you need to let me know? Any questions? Anything at all? No, nothing? Silence. Okay. I'll take that to mean you're just here to get on with what's on today. What do you think I might be covering today? Any thoughts? Any ideas? No? Let me see. I'd like to hear some new voices. There are some of you who are very quiet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call out people and ask you, who have I not heard from? Victoria. Hi, Victoria.
Hello.
Hello. How are you?
Fine, thanks. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. How do you like the course?
Yeah, I'm actually enjoying it.
Good, good. Is there anything particular you want to know more about?
I'm actually not sure right now. Maybe someone else wants to ask.
Okay. All right. Thanks for that. Nice hearing your voice, Victoria. Margarita.
Good
Hello.
afternoon, Professor. Hello.
Good afternoon. How are you?
Very well, thank you.
Excellent. How are you finding the course?
I really like this course. I started working on first home assignments. I chose countries, Germany and French.
Okay, that's really good to hear.
Thank you.
Excellent. Lovely. Good to hear. That's exactly what I like to hear. Started working on my assignment. Anna. Anna Gavkalyuk. Yes. Hello.
Yeah. Good evening. Yeah.
How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you very much. I really enjoy your course, and I appreciate that you're lecturing right now at the HSE.
Excellent. Lovely. Oh, I lost Tamerlan and the dog. I was just going to ask, hello, dog.
Oh, this is an educated one, legal dog.
Oh, really?
Yes. She was listening to many lectures online.
Excellent, exactly. You know, but just make sure that both of you don't collude to write the answer. Assignments, there should be no collusion between you and dog. What's he called or what's she called?
This is Chicaletta.
Chica.
Yes,
Chicaletta.
and she's Maltese.
All right, yes, she's a Maltese, yes.
Yes, very educated dog.
Very quiet and very reflective, it looks like. Well done.
Jeez.
Yeah. Look,
Okay.
there's somebody clever over here who has written their name completely Russian, so I can't actually call them out. I'll find a way. Wait.
Maybe
Anastasia.
it is me. So my name is Yulia Krylova. Good afternoon or good.
Good evening. Yes. Hello.
Good evening. Hello.
What's your name?
Yulia Krylova.
Yulia. Hi, Yulia. How are you doing?
great. I'd like to thank you for an interesting course.
You're very welcome. Nice to hear your voice, Julia.
Thank you.
Daria Poplativa.
Hi, good evening. So
Hi.
I really like your course. Now I'm working on our essay, and I find this task really interesting. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the feedback, and nice to hear your voice. Vatanavigun Nantapat.
Yes, good evening.
Hello, good evening.
Am I audible?
How are you? Yes, yeah, you're perfectly audible. How are you?
All right. I'm good, thank you.
Very good, very good. How is it going on this course?
I liked it so far. I liked we already got into the Paris Agreement and the articles that you have mentioned last time, but it's quite lengthy and long, so I need to maybe revise them a little bit.
Don't you worry about that. We're going to go into dive into some of it today as well. So yes, I agree. It's lengthy and long. Well done on trying to engage with it. Keep doing it. Remember, we only have one Paris Agreement. So it's a good job you don't have many. Yeah, good stuff. Good stuff. Yeah, keep doing that. Keep engaging. Keep doing your own work around how to deepen your knowledge. So do you have any thoughts about any particular topics you would like me to go in depth into?
Probably I would like to know more about how each countries implement in their own regulations about the climate change and how they. I'm not sure if they could align with the Paris Agreement obligation, but it's not really obligation. But if there are any countries that they follow the agreement.
Yeah, good point. Very good point. And good active thinking about it. You know, we had the Paris Agreement. How does each country implement? And you'll be happy to hear that's what today's lecture is really going to be about. So wait for it. Good stuff. Is there a shorter name for you? Your name is as long as my full name, but then I shorten my name. What's your short name?
Watanawikan is my last name, but
I see.
My name is Nontapat, but in Thailand we have, yes, you can call me just Pat or Patty, Patrick, or anything that.
Nontapat is, I think, a bit more shorter than Watanawigun. Although I can get it now, but Nontapat.
Right.
Yeah, Pat is too generic. Patrick is, I don't know. It takes it away from the real name. So I prefer Nontapat. Lovely, lovely talking to you, Nontapat. So yes, let's get into what you're interested in this lecture. Excellent. So would love to say hello to everyone, but I think then we won't have much time for today. But we're going to do some in-class work. So I'm going to try and pick up, if I can, listen to other people who I haven't called out at this point. Right, brilliant. So let's look at today's content. Let me share my screen. Where is my screen? Yeah. I haven't shared it yet. Now it's there. All good? You can see it?
Yes.
Excellent. Lovely. So in today's session, which is session 4 of this module, Legal Implications of Climate Change, we will be looking at climate change mitigation. It's session 4 and it's also article 4. How about that? And we will look at and map out the exact nature of the obligations of states, right? So we want to know, the real business. How is this going to happen? How are states going to address global warming and result in bringing down that global warming? Okay. And the legal framework is built up of the concept of obligation. Only if you obligate an entity to do something, we can later on question why they did not carry their obligation out or how well they carried on their obligation. So that's why it's quite crucial to chisel, carve, identify what is the obligation of each state towards making sure that we don't have runaway global warming. The structure of the lecture. We will start by looking at this question that's now being asked or being put to the International Court of Justice. So we will look at a current case that is before the International Court of Justice asking exactly this question. What are the obligations of states with respect to climate change? Okay. So this will enable you to know what it is that the case is about, what they're actually asking, how are the questions being asked, and what to expect. What is the schedule for this year in 2024? How is this case going to proceed? So it's something that you can keep a lookout for after even we finish this course. Second, we look at the nationally determined contributions. So the simple, straightforward answer for obligation of states is that they actually contribute through what they said they would. Each nation determine for themselves what they're going to contribute to reduce the emissions so that global warming will come down. So that we need to break down into more detail. Yeah. How do we find out where the national determined contribution is? We looked at some of the frameworks in the Paris Agreement for that. We said in the Paris Agreement, it has to be publicly available. So if it's public available, then we'll go look at it and we'll see what they are. So this will give us an idea about the details of how the states discharge their obligation to what they agreed in the Paris Agreement. Then we look at global stocktake. Okay, they have NDC. They've had it for a while now, not for too long, but for a while. So let's put all these NDCs together and then let's stocktake. Let's say if 10 countries did these together, then what is the implication of that towards global reduction of emissions? Okay, so we need to put everything together. Only then we'll have a clear idea of what impact NDCs are having on global emissions reduction, which in turn will have an impact on reducing the global average temperature. And then we will finally look at LTLEDS. This is another mechanism that is part of the Paris Agreement. It is also something that states have agreed they would do. So this is a long-term thing, okay? So NDC, we already know it's every 5 years. You have to keep producing new NDCs and you have to keep increasing ambition. And then the global stocktake is going on a linked cycle, and it'll keep collecting these NDCs and keep looking at the increased ambition. Is it enough towards the ultimate Article 2 objective, which is to keep the global average temperature rise above pre-industrial levels to 1.5 and not going beyond 2. But the LT-LEDS is much longer. Yeah, the whole difference between NDC, LT-LEDS is the very long term or the longer term. Because if you want to plan for the next 5 years, you also have to plan in terms of if the Paris Agreement has to hit by 2050, what will it look like? Maybe we can't do a LT-LEDS up to 50. We could do it for the up to next 20 years and then do next 20 years. So you can see so today's lecture really hangs around these different time framed obligation of states towards mitigation. Right. The first topic, this question, what is the obligation of states in respect of climate change that has now come up before the International Court of Justice? I said climate change law includes principles of public international law. And this is one example of how public international law is serving the needs of climate change law. The International Court of Justice contains a statute, or the founding of the International Court of Justice was possible because of the statute, and number of articles in that statute enable the functioning of the International Court of Justice. And it also lays out how the International Court of Justice can be asked to comment, decide on a dispute on an issue. So Article 65 of the ICJ statute allows for a mechanism known as an advisory opinion. Advisory opinion on a legal issue. So the legal issue that was taken by the United Nations General Assembly as a whole through its resolution to approach the International Court of Justice to clarify and to lay out what is the obligation of states. Okay, so just to be clear. Now, this advisory opinion was taken up before the court, and the court agreed to take it on its list of cases in April 2023. And the link below that I've given is a link to all the documents that have been submitted as part of the case since April 2023, including the UNGA, the United Nations General Assembly resolution that first initiated this whole process. So what did they want the advisory opinion on? It's in two parts. The first part, what are the obligations of states under international law to ensure the protection of the climate system and other parts? Someone has their, okay, I think it's off. The protection of the climate system and other parts of the environment from anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases for states and for present and future generations. We'll unpack this as we go along in the slides. The second part of the request from the General Assembly for an advisory opinion is what are the legal consequences under these obligations for states where they, by their acts or their omissions, have caused significant harm to the climate system and other parts of the environment, particularly with respect, firstly, to states, including, in particular, the small island states, okay, small island developing states, which because of their geographical circumstances and level of development are injured or specifically affected or are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. And part two, to the peoples and individuals of the present and future generations affected by the adverse effects of climate change. So a number of issues, concepts, principles, areas of law that the International Court of Justice has to be pulling together in order to answer these questions. And that's why it's designed like this as well. All of these come from the concerns that the members of the UN General Assembly have seen within their jurisdictions in different ways. It might either be through protests coming from people in different countries. It could be through litigation that has been initiated in different jurisdictions, using various different legislation and claims, and also issues coming out from the discussions and the COP meetings that have been progressing since 1992. A brief word on what's going to happen in 2024. The schedule for the advisory opinion to be given. The court has extended some of the deadlines. So the first deadline is written submissions can come from all the parties themselves. So we're talking about states saying, what do they think are their obligations with respect to climate change? Okay. So all of these written submissions, you can see them as they are submitted to the court. The court uploads it on that link that I've given below. And then there is time up to the 24th of June for states to comment on the written submissions of other states. Okay, so Russia can comment on China, China can comment on Russia. So that this now gives the International Court of Justice views on how states themselves view their obligations to be. Yeah. Well, don't hold your breath after that. The Court of Justice has to consider what to do after that. They will release another schedule saying what are the next steps, or, well, we know what the next steps are according to the procedures laid out in the ICJ statute, but the time frame for the next steps will all be considered as and when this schedule of ICJ cases submissions are in. So let's take a moment to now consider what the court might come to a decision on question A and question B. For that, let's actually analyze the question as well, because we do need to understand what the different components are of the question itself. What is the question actually asking? So, what are the obligations of states under international law to ensure the protection of the climate system? So, the question is not what are the obligations of states to reduce emissions, right? So this question is about how can the climate system be protected? The next question is, what do we mean by the climate system? We've used the word climate change so far, but now you have climate system. Well, for a general understanding, what we're talking about is the problem of global warming that is affecting the climate, or the weather. And that is sufficient for now for us to understand climate system. Protection of the climate system. So states have obligations to protect, right? So we're not talking about the obligations of other non-state actors. So this question, the scope of the question needs to be understood first. And it's not only the climate system, but we're also looking at other parts of the environment. Yeah, what might this be? So it'll be quite interesting to see how the International Court of Justice handles this particular part of the question. Now, what is it actually protecting the climate system from? It is protecting it from anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases. So we are talking about not the natural cycle of increase of temperature, but we are talking specifically about human-made emissions, anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases for states and for present and future generation. So I suppose in an attempt to answer the question, for sure, when they're looking at the obligation of states towards protection of the climate system, they're going to be looking at the UN climate regime, and no doubt they are going to look at nationally determined contributions, but it's not going to be a straightforward, oh, obligation of state is equal to fulfillment of nationally determined contributions. It's going to be way more complex than that, and what will be interesting for us to see is the Paris Agreement the only legal framework which creates obligation of states? And that is a very, very interesting question to consider and answer. But we don't have too much time to go into that sort of analysis, because our job is to actually look at what is the UN climate regime, what is the NDC, because we have a lot of work to do before we then go on to, are there any obligations, are there any other legal rules outside of the UN climate regime? Yeah. But as a general answer, yes, you should always look for, are there any customary rules in international law to make sure no harm is caused to the environment? Yeah, so that's the sort of line of thinking I'm taking. Now, there's a reason why I stuck this as a different color, a green color. This idea of what are the obligation of states for or towards present and future generation. Now, this looks a bit similar to part B of the question that was asked, right? So one option may be that you can suggest, well, part B of the question is actually looking at obligations towards present and future generations of peoples, of individuals. So why don't we merge this part of this question, A with question B? So maybe the court might take that option when it looks at this question and says we could take it together with part B or question B that's been raised. But perhaps they shouldn't merge it with question B, because there is a real risk that the court could easily dismiss the whole of question B. So it could basically say, you know, as far as the obligation of states towards people is concerned, that's all channeled again through the UN climate regime, which essentially is an international treaty, which means it raises obligations between states, and then that's how the trickle down benefits will go. But directly towards peoples, no, it doesn't have. So let's say if that's how the court is going to take an approach to question B, then the whole of question B is going to be gone. And at least then in question A, we could perhaps say we might think to a certain extent that obligation, like states might have direct obligation towards present and future generations. It becomes quite important in the context, particularly of looking at a high emitting state where the impacts of climate change are not being felt immediately, but it might be felt by peoples from a different state. Okay, so therefore, this sort of cross-boundary obligation of the states might even be considered in this context. And of course, those of you who have a human rights bent of mind are already thinking about, well, it is essential to look at what the human rights law can contribute, or how will the ICJ consider application of human rights law in deciding the obligation of states. Okay, so that's a bit about potentially how question A might be answered and how the ICJ might look at considering the two parts of the question. So then we have NDC Paris Agreement as potentially the answer for a major part of the obligation of states towards protection of the climate system. So what then is the NDC Paris Agreement provisions? So this is a bit of a recap at what we did last week as well, but to now look at it and string it together as a whole, yeah, because you do need to recall some of the provisions as you go along from memory as well. So talking about it again over here will help develop that sort of a muscle memory around NDC. So obligation of states under international law is to ensure the protection of the climate system from anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases for states is laid out in the Paris Agreement and obliges states to do the following. Okay, so this could be a potentially what, the court could come up with an answer. They could say that states, so it obliges states to transparently, and that is laid out in Article 13 of Paris Agreement, undertake to rapid reductions of greenhouse gas emissions after peaking as early as possible on the greenhouse gas emissions. And this is stated in Article 4. There's an obligation to strengthen resilience and reduce vulnerability towards climate change as laid out in Article 7. Developed country parties provide financial resources to assist developing country parties with respect to both mitigation and adaptation under Article 9, use existing and new technology and technology transfer under Article 10, and capacity build developing countries, and particularly climate change vulnerable least developed countries, as laid out in Article 11. So this could potentially be a very narrow black letter answer for what are the obligation of states as laid out in the Paris Agreement. Those of you who are actively listening might then have thought about that slide I presented on what are the binding obligations and what are obligations that are not so binding. So the bindingness spectrum slide that I presented in the first lecture. And if you recall, there weren't that many provisions on the legally binding column. I definitely put some parts of Article 4 in that. I certainly did not include all of the articles mentioned here in bold in that. So that should trigger the question, if this is going to be the answer given by the ICJ, is the above statement a party's response to climate change, or are the parties have legal obligations towards protecting the climate system in this manner? Okay. So the short answer to that will be what we've said so far, using this framework of 6 different articles, is actually the state parties' response to climate change, all of which is not legally binding. And therefore, we'll have to see to what extent the answer might be short, something much shorter than this answer. Yeah. If that is the case, then we have more work to do from a legal perspective to strengthen the legal framework. But in today's lecture, we're going to see how there are some backdoors and side doors by which there seems to be strengthening of legal obligations. It's almost like, a net closing in on the states on the climate obligation. We'll see how that is actually developed. And we'll also see how that can potentially be framed as legal obligations, but only within a certain type of law. And it's a type of law that we haven't touched on so far. Okay, so looking at the answer to question B, but perhaps this might be more of a trying to get a better understanding of what question B itself is asking. And within that, rolling in some aspects of an answer that could potentially be considered by the court. So, question B, what are the legal consequences under these obligations for states where by their acts or omissions have caused significant harm to the climate system and other parts of the environment with respect to small island developing states and peoples and individuals of present and future generations, right? So that was what was question B. So all of those bits where I've underlined are key words which give you reason to stop and think, first of all, what the scope of these words are and what they actually mean in relation to each other as they progress, right? So this particular question seems to raise some new issues for climate change law. One question that comes up is, do small island developing states have a special claim to loss and damage? We saw the idea of adaptation. We saw the idea of loss and damage. All of this is enshrined in the Paris Agreement. But we started also seeing that they are looking at states not just as developed countries, as developing countries, but now also there's a category that is forming, which is placing one set of developing states in a different position to other states. Now, drawing deep from the theory of public international law, where some concepts are considered fundamental as building blocks of public international law, meaning, regulating the affairs of state interaction. The concept of statehood stands out. The Montevideo Convention on what constitutes as states gives us some key characteristics of states, out of which a state has to have a population, a state has to have a territory. These are two very important criteria for statehood. And these are two important criteria for statehood on which the whole area of public international law is actually built. And only from public international law, we're having ICJ, we're having the Paris Agreement, everything issues out from that. So when public international law spots, that there is a danger of some of these fundamental building blocks being affected, then you can see why that becomes an important consideration for a key institution such as the United Nations General Assembly, which is made up of states, right? So looking at it from that perspective as well, from a purely public international law perspective, a category of developing states that might lose their territory, will they even remain states after that? Yeah, this is a very serious question. Because if they don't remain states, they don't have any recognition as a entity in public international law, or rather the strongest recognition as a player, an actor in public international law is for states. So if they lose that strong status, there's all sorts of implications from it, legal implications. So perhaps the danger that climate poses or climate change poses to territories disappearing, the loss of territory, is one of the interesting analyses that might flow from considering this question about whether, developing states who are island nations and can be engulfed by the rising sea levels, do they have a special claim to loss and damage? And does loss and damage then for them look to restore the loss and damage? Ideally, that's what you want, right? So even if you look at national laws, municipal law on how do you calculate compensation, how do you calculate damages, you're going to try and put the party back into the original position before the whole damage, their right was infringed. right? So we apply the same sort of ideas to loss and damage over here, and then say, are we saying that if Mauritius is going to disappear into the water, that they have actually lost the territory? Now, some interesting thoughts come out from that. If Mauritius has disappeared under or into the water, does the territory not remain? Does the territory always have to remain above the water level? Is that a criteria? Well, certainly Montevideo Convention doesn't lay that out as a criteria. So what does it actually mean? Do we say Mauritius has lost its territory, or do we say Mauritius's territory is under the water? But what are the legal implications for that? Well, we can carry on in this vein looking at what the legal principles are, but let's wait and see what the court actually says. Do peoples and individuals of the present and future generations have rights directly against a state that violates its obligation of not causing harm to the environment? So here we are looking at a state has obligations against other states, but what about a state directly to the peoples? But here you have the temporal element, the present generation and the future generation. We know the concept of intergenerational equity is a concept in environmental law. Yeah, intergenerational. What kind of obligations might we currently living on Earth have towards those perhaps who have not even born here on Earth? Yeah, that's another whole area of looking at what is the right of future generations. In another area of law, we do have this category of an unborn child. Yeah, so property law, for example. Different countries' property laws are different, but they do consider the category about who are called successors or who are heirs for a particular property. And that time you do consider even the position of the unborn child. But within that area of law, you have certain principles. So similarly, within environmental law, you have this concept of intergenerational equity. So then within climate change law, perhaps there is another concept over here about intergenerational equity, especially in the context of global warming and climate change. So that is the sort of direction that this question is asking. Just to give you an example, does the US have any obligation to an individual in Chad suffering from food security? Interestingly, there's quite a bit of different types of analysis by which you can identify which is the most vulnerable country in the world, which is the most affected country in the world because of climate change. So there's different criteria you can apply to talk about which is the most affected. Yeah, the affected can be in various ways. In looking at many of the indicators, it does happen that the country of Chad in Africa, in the northern half of Africa, is a big sufferer. Yeah, I mentioned Chad because we tend to think about climate change and we think about island nations and rising sea levels, but we may not always think about the desertification that comes from climate change that is happening because of climate change and the other impacts that it's having. So Chad is one that suffers from such an impact. Yes, its impact is on the the crop protection and the food security. So this is a very real situation that Chad currently is suffering from food issues, food scarcity. It will in the future suffer as well. And we can all agree as well that the world's largest emitter as of now, that is also a reality. And therefore, it's not too far off to even use these two examples to say, does the US have any obligations to an individual in Chad suffering from food security? Yeah. Does the US have any obligations to the people of Chad as a whole, because a large number of them are suffering from food security, food insecurity? Slightly different kind of question, but in human rights law, we have collective rights as well as we have individual rights. Yeah. So this could be considered within the framework of human rights law. So we could talk about the right to development of the peoples of Chad, and is that being affected by those states who have not fulfilled their obligations in terms of protection of the environment against climate change. Protection of the climate system. The next question is, does the US have an obligation to future citizens in Chad towards their right to development? So there's an argument about if we emit greenhouse gases because we carry on activities of consumption and production. But if we surpass the global average temperature rise more than 1.5, more than 2, this question is going to get very serious because of all the impacts. In that case, the patterns of production and consumption in the future are going to be affected. They need to be curtailed. You need to produce less. You need to consume less. So that then affects the right to development. When we say we have developed heavily through producing more and through consuming more. So if we already know that in the future, they have to produce less and they have to consume less, should we not take away some of that burden from them, the future generations, and put it on ourselves? And we say ourselves, who exactly? Yeah. So this is the sort of thinking that may form part of the looking at the question. I haven't given the answer straightforward because that's going to take us into a whole different lecture. But we would like to stay and look at in depth onto our question of NDC, okay? Because that's the first question. So the rest of today's lecture is going to be around NDC. NDC, nationally determined contributions. They're said to be voluntary, right? They're voluntary contributions. We said in the Paris Agreement, the nationally determined contribution is an innovation because this innovation is what brought all the countries to the table and not the historically high emitters, who were the ones who were determined to have obligations of reducing emissions under the Kyoto Protocol. So we wanted to move forward from that and say all countries need to have an obligation. But we framed that saying they can voluntarily take on reducing emissions. Well, if NDCs are voluntary, how can we then look at an NDC obligation, right? So that's what this section is going to deal with. So let's break this down. Let's break the concept of obligation down, okay? That can be broken down into an obligation of conduct and an obligation of result, okay? So we can say that there is an obligation of conduct because of the nationally determined contributions laid out under Article 4 of the Paris Agreement. But there is no obligation of result that is required. Now, you could argue saying, what's the point if you don't get the result? And yes, fair point. This is why you have critics that say that the Paris Agreement is weak because it's not as legally binding as the commitments undertaken under the Kyoto Protocol. Yeah, fair game. And you'd be right. But why are you right? You have to explain it and reason it because of what we find NDCs. Another way of putting it is that NDC is not fully an obligation, but that would still be an overarching statement about the nature of obligation. But a good way to understand NDC obligation is that it requires obligations of conduct, but it does not require obligation of result. So what is that obligation of conduct? What do they have to do? Well, certainly they don't have to conduct themselves in such a way that they get the result. So it falls short of that. We saw in 4.2 this requirement of preparing the NDC, communicating the NDC, and maintaining the NDC at a very starting level. Then they have to, and this is the biggest obligation of conduct, the strongest obligation of conduct, they have to pursue their NDC. If they are saying that they would reduce the emission up to this point and will use this policy to do that, then they have to have that policy if it's not already there, or they have to implement that policy it's there. So they have to pursue the nationally determined contribution. But what is the nature of this monitoring of this pursuance of NDC? It is a good faith expectation. We expect the countries to do it because they have said so. So other countries and also the people's individuals are taking the pursuance of NDC in good faith, right? When the negotiations were taking place, there were various camps. There were some countries that said this was not actually enough. Naturally, you will expect AOSIS countries to do it, the small island states grouping. South Africa, again, said it was not enough. EU also said not enough. So at this point, you also have to hark back to some of the theory we looked at. What are the different approaches? So if you look at climate change as an environmental problem, if you look at it as an economic opportunity, or if you look at it as climate justice, so you can then justify and argue on what basis an obligation conduct can actually be justified. And you can also look at what approach the countries are taking to arrive at accepting that obligation of conduct and why they perhaps don't accept the obligation of result that you might think is a natural consequence of pursuing NDCs. Alongside that, the obligation of conduct is also around transparency. So Article 13, 7 and 11 talk about facilitative multilateral consideration of progress. So, I can't be my own judge as a state. I can't lay out an NDC, and I should cooperate with others and allow them to see what I'm doing and, have this multilateral dialogue and consider what progress is together. Yeah, when I say it out to you, does it sound reasonable if I have said I'm pursuing NDC and I've done this? Does the other party consider that to be reasonable as well? So those are the outcomes that are possible to have if you have a multilateralism operating in the context of transparency of pursuance of NDC. Obligation of result. What does that mean? There is no obligation of result. There is no need to achieve their NDC, bluntly put. Yeah, does the law require them to? No. That's rather a simplistic way of looking at it, but nevertheless, there is no obligation of result. Yeah, it may flow naturally from it, and that's what we are hoping will happen. We can think of various reasons why. Yeah, states want to develop, states want to produce, states want to consume, because the economic model that has been set up that states are operating under is based on production and consumption. Yeah. So that might be the reason why they would want to pursue or stay on that path. I mean, so far as climate change law is concerned, we see no threat to a system that thrives on production and consumption. Yeah. So in the negotiations, you can see some of the countries, especially the large ones, also on the top 5 list of emitters, the top countries with the fastest growth rates. All of them are the ones that are more cautious and take a more individual approach to how they're going to reduce emissions. Yeah. So India, US, China, again, felt it was too much to accept an obligation of result with respect to the NDC. Okay, so that's about the voluntary NDC, but what does it mean legally? Can we identify any obligation? Yes, you can identify an obligation of conduct. No, you cannot identify an obligation of result. Okay. Let's now look at, we've considered the nature of obligation. So how do they pursue their NDC? Individual countries do it by themselves, but collectively, we talked about the ratchet mechanism through time. The wheel keeps turning and you can never go back. You submitted one NDC, you then have in your second NDC, you're going to have to make it better. You have to have a higher ambition. You have to have the highest possible ambition. Yeah. So now you can see how that could potentially roll the wheels onto the final destination of your 2050 net zero target. Let's have a look. What's happened so far? The Paris Agreement is 2015. A lot of work was done before the Paris Agreement. We saw the whole list of COPs. So in order for the Paris Agreement to take its shape, the architecture of the Paris Agreement was based on the discussions that were had in previous COPs. In previous COPs, what did they agree on? INDC, intended nationally determined contributions, right? All of these intended nationally determined contributions are put together in what is known as a synthesis report, and the aggregate effect of the INDCs was calculated. And that's what led to the adoption of the Paris Agreement, to say, it looks like, countries, when asked to reduce emissions, are putting up good enough policies, or rather policies that certainly are very, very good starting points. And that's what the INDC's aggregate effect was. 2016, Paris Agreement was signed. So it was very, very quickly ratified. Yeah, didn't expect that 55% of the parties covering 55% of the global emissions, which was a condition for the Paris Agreement to enter into force, would be achieved so quickly. Yeah, in 2016 itself. Well, once that had been achieved, then you're going to have to start looking at what is the NDC. Do your NDC, start doing global stocktake. All of that mechanism starts kicking in. So now in order to do that, the dialogue about this 1.5, 2 degrees Celsius took place. How could we solidify or get countries to think very much on the lower figure than the higher figure? The institutional structure of the Intergovernmental Panel also provided the normative environment. They provided the most up-to-date science in their reports. So by 2018, we had all of that. We also had the rules further developed. And this is something that we'll come to in detail very shortly, to look at what is this new area of legal rules that are creating obligations under a certain area of law, which it is interesting to see how climate change law is employing this other area of law. So 2018, then you had the situation of that new rule book being created. By 2020, presentations of another round of NDCs. So states could revise, states could present or reflect their current position at that time to submit their NDCs. And the first ever global stocktake. So stocktake takes place every 5 years. So we completed the first global stocktake in December 2023, and the UAE consensus is very much a response to what needs to be done now that we have looked at the aggregate effect of the global stocktake that took place in December 2023. And in the future, this thing, the same kind of process will carry on. We'll have another round of NDC, we'll have another round of stocktake, and then we move forward, right? But there will be changes as we go along, depending on how we are seen to meet that main goal of Article 2 in Paris Agreement. So remember, all of these are in aid of Article 2. Let's say that even after the recommendations given in this second global stocktake, we fall quite short of the fossil fuel phase out, which was one of the decisions we saw came out of the UAE consensus. But then maybe extra measures or extra procedures or this cycle of 5 years, 2 years, 1 year, etc. That's going to probably also be tweaked as we go along as well. Yeah, so this is a living process. What the overall Paris Agreement allows us to do is to be able to develop and change the rules in a much quicker and responsive pace than the main aim. The main aim is still Article 4, which is mitigation, which in turn contributes to Article 2. But within that, we have these rule books, which can be changed in a much faster pace and quicker way in order to respond to the science, respond to the policies. Right. Harking back to Article 412, which we looked at in the last session, there is the need for a publicly maintained NDC registry. Now, this registry was designed as a freestanding registry, not linked with other things in the Secretariat. Otherwise, it's not going to be easy for states to upload and change things as they would need to change, because it's all left to them. There will be a lot of administrative layers. It has to go to the Secretariat. They have to look at it and put up there. So they rather decided that it's going to be a separate part. Yeah. So here's the link that houses all of the nationally determined contributions that are presented by the states according to their obligations, both the substantive and the procedural, i.e. transparency obligations that they have under the Paris Agreement. So to give you an idea of what you will find if you go into this website, this is what you'll come up with, okay? And so this is a screenshot of that website. It shows 30 of 195 results. Of course, my screenshot doesn't show 30, but that page itself showed. So totally there's 195 NDCs that have been submitted. Okay, you can see the party, what is the document, the title. Some of the terms over here you need to know specifically. So I have, in the next slide, I'll be looking at a sort of a short glossary for how you understand the terms that are used in the NDC website when you look at it, registry when you look at it. So you have language here, and many countries choose to put the NDCs, frame their NDCs in their official languages, which is only natural because the non-state actors that would want to read it in their countries will find it more accessible. But at the same time, we also need to find it accessible. So you've got translations. So then you look at versions, status, active. So it's possible eventually that they might want to be able to say, well, actions within this are now complete and closed. We have a new policy, new scheme. So we're going to, keep producing new ones, and rather than, so that might then make this particular NDC not so active. Or in some cases, let's say that a country pulls out of an agreement. Yeah, the United States did pull out of the Paris Agreement at one point. So if it pulls out, then it may not be active. Their NDCs will not be actively implemented. When was the submission date? Any other additional documents? Okay, so this is what you will be able to see. Right, so once you go into these NDCs, there's terminology that's used. And here's an example. It's not an exhaustive list of all the terminology, but I'll give you an idea of some of the repetitive terms that you would see featured in NDC. Absolute targets. So you might find that we will achieve net zero by 2050. That is an absolute target. Qualitative target, they won't commit to an absolute target, but they will say, we have put in place this policy that will reduce this much of emissions. Okay, so they might have some numbers in that qualitative targets, but they may not ultimately give one target figure for that. And they might have another policy which says, oh, we will put in place this particular policy, not necessarily attached to a number. So it could be a combination of numbers and non-number of policies, or it could be purely policies, or it could just be absolute targets. So qualitative targets is more that which talks about policy. Conditional. So conditional is the results that they might get based on whether there is support that is received, because we saw that there are provisions in the Paris Agreement that required developed countries to facilitate technology transfer to developing countries. Developed countries or developing countries to receive finance. So these are all, if they receive finance, if they receive the technology, then they can achieve this much, is what is a conditional plan. Unconditional, so it's not contingent on receiving such sort of support from external actors. The country themselves will do what they have committed to do under this. So as you can guess, unconditional will be something that's lower, conditional will be higher, because it has to be, if conditional is lower than unconditional, then that's cause for concern. Okay, where is that money going? BAU, business as usual, fancy term for. But this is very important because we are looking at how the Paris Agreement and the NDC mechanism is responsible for the shift in policy. Okay. If that's not actually, there's no point to the Paris Agreement. If the country was anyway going to go ahead and do something. Yeah. So business as usual will be something, and there will be other policies which says when we bring in electrical vehicles in, then we're going to have this much of reduction emission. So BAU is business as usual. INDC, intended NDC. This is historical. As I said, it was in the run-up to the Paris Agreement to get an idea of what levels of commitment states are willing to make. Revised. So revised, enhanced, updated, these are terms that you'll find sometimes a bit interchangeable. Like I said, the Paris Agreement got ratified quite quickly, to the surprise of many parties. They thought they had a little bit of time to create the rule book, but that wasn't the case. Very good. It came into force as soon as it did, or at the time that it did, quite quickly. But that meant that there was a race to get the rules finished in terms of how the NDCs have to present it, etc. So a lot of states, what they did was they converted the INDC into their NDC, and then they realized that they needed to give more detail. So what they did, they either revised it or updated it. But enhancement will be specifically a reference to higher targets, higher levels of emissions reduction, etc. Okay, so you will find these words being used to describe the NDC is version. CTU, clarity, transparency, understanding. So whatever is written in the NDC has to satisfy these conditions, and that the CTU criteria are laid out in the main Paris Agreement itself. It's not a choice that's made. It is something it falls under the obligation of conduct. Yeah. So when you present the NDC, it should not be unclear. Clarity should be there. It should be transparent. It should give as much detail as is necessary for the understanding of what you're talking about. Friends of rules, a group of countries that play a role in engaging with creating those rules of CTU, rules about what should be there in the NDC, in what way, in what format. So the rule books, the Paris rule book, the Katowice rule books, etc. Registry is the public registry of NDC. Ambition cycle. This is the idea that the NDC always has to have the ambition increased, and the methodology by which that happens is both internal and external. Right? Internal, the states themselves have obligations directly under the Paris Agreement. The external is when you have the stock takes feeding back to say, we need to do more, we need to do more, okay? Collectively, we need to do more. What does that mean for each of you? You have to raise. So when we talk about this cycle of progression of NDCs, it is about, it's characteristically ambitious cycle. GHG intensity target. This is a term that is in the context of understanding economic growth and emissions. So for every unit of greenhouse gas that is emitted, what is the gross value added to the economy? Okay, what is the GVA in relation to the unit of GHG emitted? So that's another way of reporting. MRV, measurements, reporting, verification. So every country has to measure what its emissions are. And it is a very complex and process spread across many actors because there are many emitters, right? So you have to measure everything together, put it all together, you have to report it, and then that needs to be verified. Otherwise, how do we know what is being emitted? So it's a key part of making sure we reduce the emissions. BRT, biennial transparency report. Yeah, biennial, every 2 years, transparency report. Related to obligations of support, of finance, and elements to show how it's being spent, whether it's being spent in ways that are helping mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage. So making sure all of the goals of the Paris Agreement are undertaken in a way that is equal, or whatever attention is necessary, that needs to happen for all of the goals. Okay, so that can be visible through BTR. How are we doing for time? Right, I think it is time.
1 minute to 7:30.
1 minute to 7:30. Yeah. So I think it is time for a break, right?
Yes, please.
Yes, it is.
Yes, it is. Any questions before you go on the break?
Yeah, I think I just wanted some clarity. From the beginning, you spoke about, for example, you gave some questions about Chad and USS, and you were like, will USA be responsible for the future and all that with respect to Chad? But I wanted to find out, just of all, we all know that maybe US is rank higher when it comes to the country in charge of emissions and all that. But why is the question only on US but not other contributors? Because sometimes law makes certain regulations or frameworks, or let's say policies, but it is very difficult to understand why these laws are put in place, because definitely it is not only the emissions from US that is affecting the people of Chad. Collectively, even countries that are emitting smaller still have an impact on Chad. So why is such kind of questions?
I mean, simple answer. Sorry if it wasn't clear. It was just an example to situate, obligation of states towards peoples. That's all. Yeah, it could be any state that is a party has an obligation for mitigation, so it can fall on any state. All right. But the reason I picked US was because it is the highest emitter. If I picked, for example, Pakistan, question might be, well, why Pakistan? Yeah. But the obligation falls equally on all states. Yeah. It was just an example, an illustration to understand what that question was about. Yeah. And like I said, I picked Chad up as well because it suffers a lot from the impacts of climate change. Okay, all right. So 10 minutes break and we get back. Right. All 21 present. It's time yet, right? Tamer?
Yes, we're back.
Is it 10 minutes yet?
Yes, it's time. Yeah.
Lovely. Okay, so quite a lot of stuff in that first half. So what did we look at in the first half? We looked at NDC, broke down the nature of its obligation, looked at it as obligation of conduct. Conduct to do what? To be transparent. So to present the ambitions for reduction of emissions in a certain way within a certain period of time, and to accept feedback on it in order to go for deeper emission cuts. Okay, so that's what we have looked at so far when it comes to the NDC. We're going to look at what are the rules that were developed, okay, in the next few slides. And after which I'm going to ask you to look at the NDC submissions. I've chosen a list of countries that I would like you to look at, and then we'll come back and discuss to see what pros and cons you have identified in the NDC. But in order to do that, I should give you some criteria, because this is the criteria in which the countries have to submit as well. So you're going to have to assess whether you find all of this in the countries that have submitted, right? So let's get back to the slides and look at what happened at one of the significant COPs following the Paris Agreement. Okay. So, introduction to administrative law that has developed around addressing climate change. The NDC administrative law. It's what I call it, by the way. 2018 in Poland, in Katowice. As it happens, it was a former coal area, coal-intensive area. In last week's lecture, I played you a video where you saw the Paris Agreement being adopted by the member states, and you had the gavel, a rather funny gavel that was being struck down. And look at how this COP24 was finally concluded, with the president of the Katowice COP literally jumping out of his seat to celebrate the success of the establishment of the Paris Agreement rulebook, which sometimes, slightly confusingly, is also referred to as the Katowice rulebook, because it was adopted in Katowice, but technically it is the Paris Agreement rulebook. So a bit of history for that. CTU, clarity, transparency, understanding requirements, was being discussed even before Paris. So the Lima COP in the COP20, and then the Paris COP, that is COP21. So a quick digression into how to read details in citations that you might find about documents coming from various UN climate regime meetings. So what you see here in the slide is the first decision that was taken. So number 1 / where at a COP meeting, so CP, which number? 20. Okay, so just a simple COP document reference over here. So Lima COP laid out expectations around transparency. COP21 para 27 extended on that. They essentially talked about 7 elements that the nationally determined contributions should contain, should reflect, should elaborate. Quantifiable information on the reference point, including as appropriate a base year. So they talk about, if I'm reducing emission, am I reducing it with respect to 2025, 2023, 2019, or 2005, or 1950? Okay, so there must be a reference point here that is clearly mentioned. So the earlier the reference point, the more difficult it is to meet, because if it's 1950, the amount of emissions that the country has actually made will be much lesser than, let's say, if it's 1995. So that's to give you a bit of context about how reference points might be set. Time frame or periods of implementation. So is it 2050, 2060, 2070, 2030? These are all significant years, by the way, for policy as well as law for climate action. 2030 is significant. For example, the EU has given a target of emissions reduction, legal target for 2030. Not every other country has done that. So, but 2030 is also an important year because it is in the time frame of planning a reasonably closer year than 2050. Yeah. So if we want to think about the political cycles in countries and what they can commit to, they're not going to really, a political party now might not reap the benefits of whatever policies they might put for action in 2050, but they might reap benefits for any policies that they put in place now, which might be within the next, election cycle. So for various reasons, these time frames and periods become significant. So, but that has to be mentioned. So the NDC should talk about what they're going to achieve, by when they're going to achieve, and if there's different things that they want to achieve, then a time frame for each of those significant landmarks. Scope and coverage, greenhouse gas emissions, right? So the overall greenhouse gas emissions concept is laid out in the main treaty, but it may be possible that in certain periods of time they might concentrate on CO2. Perhaps the focus might be more on methane, or it could be that in certain industry they are going to regulate by using methane reduction as a indicator. In other industries they may not. So scope and coverage could be with respect to DHG emission. The scope and coverage could be with respect to their different parts of their territory. So now you can start seeing why by having more transparency, using these criteria, you get a lot more detail, a lot more information, and indirectly, a lot more commitment, it may be hoped. Planning processes. So they also should be talking about how they do their planning for all of this. Okay, it's not just enough to say, I have all of this ambition, but you have to say how seriously you're taking it. And that you can only do so if you're planning for it. Yeah, and planning, you do it from the time the ink dries on your NDC. So another way of, getting countries to act. Assumptions and methodological approaches, including those for estimating and accounting for anthropogenic greenhouse emissions and, as appropriate, removals of GHG from the atmosphere. So they could accept and apply the methodological approaches that are used by the IPCC in how they measure and monitor. But then that's not the measuring and monitoring greenhouse gases is not the only activity that is covered in NDC. They could have methodological approaches for how they will lay out a policy, or what are the technical details within to understand a policy. So it could be methodological approaches for both quantitative as well as qualitative goals laid out in the NDC. Assumptions. Yeah, So what is it that they take as underlying facts? So they build their policies, they build their quantitative approaches based on some assumptions. So it has to all be mentioned. How the party considers that its nationally determined contribution is fair and ambitious in the light of its national circumstances. This is a direct fulfillment of one of its obligations, which is that it needs to go for the highest possible ambition. Yeah. But if it doesn't go for the highest possible ambition, it might justify it by saying we need to make sure it is fair amongst all of our stakeholders within our country. And from a differentiation perspective, it is what we can do given our national circumstances, right? So if a country has no reserves or of any kind of energy other than, let's say, coal, then can it use it as, this is my national circumstance, this is what the ambition, I cannot not use coal. Yeah, in that case, then you also have to justify, have you asked for support? Have you asked for international cooperation to move away from coal? So now you can start imagining how, in the course of justifying what its nationally determined contribution to emissions reduction is, that there's lots of different calculations and policies it needs to think about. How it contributes towards achieving the objective of the convention as set out in its Article 2. Yeah. So we shouldn't lose sight of the ultimate reason for doing what we do, which is NDCs. Why do we frame NDCs? They all have to contribute towards Article 2. So the best thing is to ask the country how they think about this contributing to Article 2. And maybe when they start putting that down, they start thinking maybe we are not that ambitious in how our quantitative target is set. So that's the purpose of all of these 7 elements have been further developed and detailed in the iteration of the Paris Rulebook as it was laid out in the 2018 Katowice COP. So bear these in mind. The 2018 Katowice COP is a large document, but essentially comes down to having developed administrative rules for climate change law. So this is the snapshot of mainly what it requires. You can see more details than those 7 elements. It's deepened and it's widened and enlarged what countries need to talk about in fulfillment of those 7 elements. So mitigation, what its goals, activities, how will it communicate to efforts to adapt to climate impacts, the transparency framework, the institutional setup that it needs to feed into. So the committee to facilitate the implementation of the Paris Agreement, how to conduct the global stocktake. So now you've got some rules that are in relation to the Paris Agreement institutions, not the state institutions. So how should the global stocktake take place? How to assess the progress on the development and transfer of technology. Okay, so development of technology is one thing. Transfer of technology is a completely different thing. Yeah, so development of technology, for example, CCUS, carbon capture, usage and storage. So that is a new technology. Has it developed further? Does it need to be pushed further? Or is it a technology that perhaps it's not the best available technology? There may be another technology that we need to replace it with. It's one of the highly criticized technologies when it comes to application for achieving carbon removals. So how to advance information on financial support? Yeah, how do we present that? Establishing new targets on finance from 2025 onwards. Right, so more details, more strengthened administrative rules in relation to the obligations under 2015. Right. This is where you're going to do some work. I'm going to give you this link on chat. What I want you to do is to look at 5 different NDCs. I will give you about 20 minutes, okay, to be able to do this. So you're going to be fast and you're going to be strategic. So think about, look at the NDCs, try and understand what they are, what is their target, what sort of policy. So you can't be comprehensively looking at all of them. You don't have much time. So you need to also decide how strategic you will be in addressing or assessing these NDCs. What I want you to do is come up with some points for discussing the pros and cons of these NDCs, okay? They may have fulfilled the Katowice rule book in giving a lot of detail, but beyond that, you also have to think about the pros and cons as a whole. Okay, it's not just an exercise of compliance, it's also an exercise beyond that. Okay, so let's see. Where's the link? Okay, there you are. That's the link. So go into that link and I gave you the guidance for what to look for. Click on the link and you will have a document that'll come up. Yeah, if you have any problems, I mean, I'll be a bit off camera and turn my mic off, but you can always put questions in chats. Yeah, right. So type in what the time is there right now.
Can you project the countries we're supposed to search for again?
Yeah, I can put that on chat as well. Can you just put the time up for me?
It's 8 o'clock now, yeah.
The website's not working. Okay. Thank you. Share your screen and show me, what do you mean it's not working?
I do mean that I'm trying to load more countries to find
very
the
fast. Sorry. Okay.
Applicable NDC, yeah, and the loading of the countries is not quite fast. Yeah,
Okay,
so
okay.
you have to wait some time to reach, like Russian Federation for example, and the UK obviously in the end of the list.
All right. Okay, got you. Yeah, that's fine. I mean, I can also see if I can put up the documents.
Sorry, are we supposed to choose only one country or all of them?
No, have a look at all the 5 of them. Yeah. You can start by looking at the Russian Federation. But to have an idea of, how detailed it is, it's easier if you then compare it to another one, perhaps. Yeah. So that's why I've given a selection of different types of countries. Okay. So the point is not just about, you won't be able to read and digest everything, right? So do some comparative work as well. All right. Time up. Right. So I'd like as many of you as possible, put your cameras on. You can raise your hand to comment. You can put comments on the chat. So let's discuss the NDC documents. Who wants to kick off? Yeah, Roman.
Yeah. Shall I start with the comparison of the indices, or I can start with reviewing one of them just as a starting point, or what approach will be better?
Review one of them.
One of them, okay. Well, I personally like the Vatican's NDC because the first reason, it is really short. The second one is it is very interesting to review because the Vatican's emissions in the world emission is around 0.0000443%, so it is really low. But however, Vatican is also concerned about the global goals and achieving these goals. So they took the base year 2011. They took a reduction target as to 20%, and time frames were set at around 2030. Well, it is interesting that all countries in their indices are taking different base years. So if we take a look at UK's or Russia's and India's indices and Bangladesh, they're taking different base years, and moreover, UK is taking the different base years for different substances and emissions. Well, back to Vatican city-state, it is once more time noted that there are only 400 residents of Vatican, and the most emissions are automotive, petrol, diesel, heating gas, and oil. So the maybe impact of the Vatican's reduction of the emissions is not so let's say valuable in the global goal, but Vatican can, in my opinion, Vatican can do it because this goal is doable. They need to just optimize their usage of different substances, and I think yeah, so the Vatican's NDC is the most clear from all of them and the most doable, in my humble opinion. Well, yeah.
Okay. Do you think they've gone for the highest possible ambition?
No. I think it's not the highest possible ambition, because if you look at the target goal of the UK, they are in the first place they want to reduce by 68% their emissions by 2030, and they want to make zero emissions at 2050. And zero emissions at 2035. For cars emission. Well, in this regard, Vatican state, if they were really ambitious, they could say that we will end all the car emissions by 2035 by eliminating all the cars from the state, because the state is really small. You can just walk it through by an hour, I think. Well, yes, but the pros of this NDC is that they can do it definitely can do it if they try to, and the implementation of this NDC in practical realization can be done rather easily than ambitious goal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you go down the route of comparing countries in terms of who has more ambition, then maybe we should also think about countries that are already net zero neutral. And compared to that, Vatican seems very poor. But just one point about when you're talking about highest possible ambition, what you're going to think about is what are the barriers for Vatican in, there are 400 people and they have very few sectors, so to speak. So what is their own barriers, and are they being realistic or unambitious about considering their barriers? So don't compare one country with another country when you're talking about their highest ambition, because it's also about their own circumstances. So now you have to look at the NDC to look at, are there any circumstances to justify why, like you said, they don't have such a high ambition as is possible for, cars. They can, even if they sell off one of their, valuable, precious, antiques, they could get some money. So that's the thinking in terms of highest ambition should be an internal ambition and look at their own circumstances.
And I have also noted that Bangladesh also have some ambitions, but they also mentioned that Bangladesh is a developing country and they cannot go to the most radical ways to reduce ambitions. And for Vatican, the Holy See, it is the same way. So they have to consider the circumstances which are present for them and try to do their best. But they also should be realistic, not to say that we will reduce all emissions and not complete it at all. So yeah, it is a balanced approach.
Yeah. But also we can see that, it's actually quite difficult to reduce emissions. If you can't do it when this small group, then what chance have, US, China have got? Okay, thank you. Let's hear from others and then we can come back. I think the first hand was, could have been Mika's, I'm not sure. Yeah, Mika is the next, right? Yeah.
Yes, I was just trying to say that, first of all, disclaimer, the Russian Federation document was in Russian. So, if I'm not mistaken.
No. So you forgot to look at the translation column. So there is a translation.
Oh, okay. Then I did not. So I did not look at that specifically. But if I take into consideration the Bangladesh one, it was also small. I think 3 pages, so it's not too big. But for me,
you've confused Bangladesh's document is much longer.
Then
how big is Bangladesh? That was 37.
Oh,
Bangladesh is 37 pages long. Okay, Mika's gonna come back. In the meanwhile, Isadora.
I looked at that and I looked at India and UK. But for me, I think if you ask me which of them is quite ambitious or the most ambitious, I would say, in my own opinion, I think the UK and India are a bit ambitious because they indicated kind of, especially the UK, they want to have net zero at the end of this and all that. But I believe they can achieve that because they have already achieved quite much when it comes to that. They've played a role as more or less like a leader when it comes to this climate change idea. So they've contributed quite a lot to it, and to maintain that position, they've showed some form of leadership in that, and they can do it. They have the resources that they can also do, but the problem is there may be some constraints, not internal, but both internal and external constraints, especially recently taking into consideration the COVID-19 pandemic, and they've even indicated in their documents other constraints like the Russia-Ukraine crisis and other things which making things to go high and all that, which may affect their ability to achieve the targets at the end of the year they plan. So something I want to acknowledge. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. Isidora?
Yes, so I wasn't able, due to lack of time, to analyze it fully. But some takeaways. So I would say regarding the pros. So regarding India's NDC, so I think that they put an emphasis on prioritizing the expansion of renewable energy sources, and particularly solar and wind power. Regarding the UK, they were more emphasizing on investment in renewable energy and low carbon technologies, and to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, or to reduce economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions by at least 68% by 2030. So that's pretty ambitious, I think. Also, regarding Bangladesh, so they focus more on adaptation measures to address the country's vulnerability to climate change impacts. So that would include something like extreme weather events. Regarding Vatican, well, Raman already mentioned it, but they more put an emphasis on like global cooperation and solidarity to tackle climate change overall, and require like a shared commitment to collective action. And they also like put an emphasis on generally ethical and moral. They took a like an ethical and moral stance on the problem. And regarding cons, I could say that maybe compared to like the UK, the Russia's NDC wasn't as ambitious to reach like global climate goals. I guess some could view it as a bit modest. Also regarding India, so I mean they could face some challenges regarding like funding constraints, also technological barriers, so also there could be like some equity concerns. So particularly regarding countries like India and Bangladesh, they could be considered like more vulnerable. Their communities could face and bear like a more, I guess I could say, disproportionate burden of climate impacts due to their economy. And also regarding Russia, so since their economy is heavily dependent on fossil fuels, there could be problems regarding that, specifically since I mean, could they transition to a more low carbon economy to meet the targets effectively? So that's something I was able to summarize from what I read so far.
Yeah, no, well done. Good amount of time management and comments. So yeah, you guys are looking at the right sort of things. So you're going to have to identify a method, you know, of reading the NDCs, right? So you can use the 7 elements as the method to scour through each NDC. And as you have noticed, most countries on that list have provided you direction based on the 7 elements. So what you can then do is compare based on that 7 elements. So you can just take planning processes as one of the element and then look at all the 5 and do it that way. Okay, yeah, Zahur, your turn. Yeah, it's fine. If you've looked at NDC of Pakistan, go ahead. Did you already look at it?
Yes, I am a little bit aware of the NDC of Pakistan. So
okay, go on.
So I would speak about NDC of Pakistan.
Okay. I'll also look it up.
Like the NDC of Pakistan, which was submitted in 2015, they outlined some of the targets by reducing the greenhouse gas emission. That NDC includes the unconditional target to reduce the emission by 20% below the business as usual level by 2030. Pakistan conditional target was to reduce the emission by 30% below BAU level by 2030. Pakistan NDC also emphasized on the importance of adaptation and building resilience to climate change impacts. The key sector that targeted for adaptation measure include water, agriculture, forestry, and health. The NDC that Pakistan in 2015 committed was to increase the share of the renewable energy and its energy mix. Afforestation was a big problem, so the previous government, like that, they included in its policy, and they stated in their statement and implemented the billion tree project, and which was controversial, but the billion tree project was a success on the ground level. Regarding the agriculture and water management, the significance of agriculture in Pakistan is like it's an agriculture country, so the NDC include measures to improve the water use efficiency and enhances the agriculture productivity to promote the land management and sustainable land management. The NDC also addresses the importance of the energy efficiency measure to reduce the emission and enhance the sustainability of Pakistan energy sector. Pakistan NDC underscore the need for financial and technological support from the international community to achieve its climate goal. But these NDCs were basically, these were submitted in 2015, but Pakistan political challenges, Pakistan actual bureaucratic problem, they didn't, Pakistan didn't meet the requirement, but it's on its way to implement the NDC.
Right. So the meeting of the requirement is not about whether it's achieved the goals, right? The meeting of the requirement is it meeting CTU requirements? Yeah, clarity, transparency, understanding. Then within that, is it meeting the 7 elements? Okay.
Yes. So the elements were there, the NDC that was being submitted, all the elements were included. But regarding the implementation, there are a lot of problems, and Pakistan is now in financial crisis as well. So it always looked to the international community for financial and support.
I've just looked at Pakistan. It has 71 pages. Goodness. You should advise them to stop including glossaries and list of tables and figures and
that was I think all the things were being included just to get the financial support from the international community, but that support was never being there.
Well, I'm not sure if you produce 76 pages, you'll only lose some money that you already have.
Yeah.
Look at your counterpart. 2.5 pages. That is what India has produced.
Yeah, that's the actual problem.
Is it? Someone just said that their Isidora wants to come in. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask how often are the NDCs supposed to be updated? Because I see some are from like 2015, some are from last year.
Yeah. The NDCs have to be submitted. I mean, the reason why you find where we are now is because the first cycle of NDC has been, quite irregular because the rule book was developed in 2018. The INDs, some of them submitted INDCs as early as 2014. So some of them have just converted that. So the second NDC has now got to be submitted because the stock take is over for the first one. So now the second one has to be submitted by about 2025-26.
So that's the latest that all countries should submit new NDCs? Or
because this next cycle will kick off. The 5-year global, so 23 is the first global stock take, right? So let's say 5-yearly global stock take. So 5 years time, 28, not 23, 24, 25, 26, and then 28, yeah? So if it is 28, then need to submit about 2 years before, 2 years up to, again, countries have to submit it in time to make the synthesis report, which usually happens, let's say, March, April of 2028, because after that, they have to discuss it in the COP28 to do the global stock take and come up. They can't do the stock take in, 10 days of conferencing at the COP. So they'll need from March. So they have to submit before 1 to 2 years before the before 2028, the second or the next round of, NDCs need to be submitted by then.
And is that so? It's required for all countries. It doesn't matter whether they submitted theirs last year or like 5 years. Okay.
All countries, yeah. It's required for all countries. If you notice, it says 195 on there, what is available. But then if you notice, there's 197 or 198 with EU. So you guys have to find out who has not submitted NDC at all so far. Go have a look. Right, so now let's see. I want to hear from some different people I haven't heard before. What about Angelina Turova? Angelina?
Yes, hello. My connection is not stable. I'm sorry.
All right.
It's lagging a little bit.
That's all right. I can. Yeah, I can hear you now. Do you have any comments to make on a NDC?
I'm fully agree with colleagues. I think that some countries have a huge potential in that respect. So I think anything to add. So my colleagues outlined the main points.
All right. Well, thank you. Michael Schmidt. Michael? Okay, Pankaj?
Yes, Professor.
Hello.
Yeah, Professor. Actually, I want to add one pros of regarding the India is that India has committed to 2.5 to 3 billion of the CO2 by planting the tree around 2030. Yeah, this is a committed India. It is not added by my colleague during this discussion.
What are the implications of that? Are you saying it is fair and ambitious? Are you saying it is, what is your implication of mentioning that?
I think, Professor, it is fair, but it will depend upon the 2030, what we have achieved till date. we cannot predict about the future. Sometimes political issue also involved in this area.
Okay, this seems to be like a common theme. I mean, even when the parties signed up to the Paris Agreement, we already know there'll be political issues. What's the problem? There is always political issues for everything.
But the professor, there are also problems depend upon the location. Like in now the current scenario in India, that the farmers are making a strike against the government due to their they said that withdraw their from the WTO, and they focus on everything, include and give minimum price support to the farmer.
Correct.
But India is cannot do this one because it is committed by the India and use like the trade facilitation center. They committed that they minimize their import and
Correct.
export on their product. Yeah, professor.
So when you say increase green cover, that's not from farming. Okay, because farming means the plant will grow, it will absorb carbon dioxide, and when you harvest, the plant is going to release the carbon dioxide. Because if it is dead, it's going to release. So it's not farming having more farms. If you think that's, if I assume right in what you're saying, it's got nothing to do with the commitment India made for increasing green cover. Okay, because like you said,
they committed that. Yeah, professor, India has committed that. Yeah, India has committed that additional forest and tree cover by 2030 to absorb the 2.5 to 3 billion tons of CO2.
Correct. So that is forest and green cover. It doesn't mean farming. So green is not farming. Okay.
But the professor, the farmer use pesticides, which is harmful to the climate and to the natures.
It's true, but you're putting two different things together. If India has to achieve green cover and it has to achieve forest increase, then it needs more land to be converted to these two objectives. Yeah.
Yes, professor.
So if you are saying that by farming, they're going to maybe kill the bees and the birds so that the bees and the birds won't pollinate, then you have to explain how that methodology is the best methodology to apply to increase the green cover. Or is that an external factor to make sure that any forest green cover increase is going to be not affected by the use of pesticides, which might potentially obstruct the cycle of how trees interact with birds, because the birds and the insects might die from pesticide.
Yes, professor, and the farmer is the grassroots for the climate changes. It is a main important. Without it, we cannot achieve any targeted, I think.
Is farming the one of the industries to, I mean, when I say industry, I use it broadly, activity, anthropogenic activity that needs to be addressed as a problem, or is it part of the solution, farming?
It may be a part of a solution.
How?
Because yeah, actually the farming agriculture is a grassroots for any climate changes like deforestation and cutting of the trees and make a cultivation for the agriculture.
I have a hand up. Is that in response to Pankaj? Is that Yulia? No, I can't read it because your name is fully in Russian. In Cyrillic script. Go on.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Ma'am, it's in response. It's in response to Pankaj because I think
is
we
that
usually confuse
Siddharth?
Siddharth, yes, ma'am, Siddharth.
Okay, that's your name in Russian script. Okay.
I don't know how it came in Russian, but to respond to Pankaj's question or explanation, I think most of the time we confuse agriculture with a sort of forestation project or something. But rather than agriculture is the one of the important reasons why there is deforestation, and it is also one of the important reasons for soil erosion. And I think comparing increase of agricultural lands with the process of contributing to the goals of NDCs is like we can say confusion in a way. So rather than that, we must look at what kind of projects are taken, whether the government has taken any additional lands for forestation, whether they are going into planting of multiple trees to create artificial forest, which like to give an example, in the place where I lived, the land which is under the control of army, so rather than utilizing it just like that open grounds, they have created a sort of artificial forestation there, where they create multiple plantations in a dense forest way to create a artificial cover of forest. So I think those kinds of activities can be considered as forestation, but agriculture cannot be, because as Pankaj himself said, that it involves utilization of many of these other kinds of chemicals, which can be much more harmful and detrimental to the nature. So that's the point I wanted to clarify. I don't know whether I may be right or wrong, but that was my.
Yeah, no, that is correct. So farming is more a problem than a solution. But of course, farming is also essential, and it's in many cases a lot of the activities involved in farming can also be considered as unavoidable emissions coming out from the activity. So farming is a big part of climate action policy, okay, in from all ways, because we are talking about food security. We are talking about a just transition as well, right? So we need to make sure all, mouths are fed. That is an absolute essential for any policy. But at the same time, how do we do it in a way that it reduces its impact? And its impact is huge. All types of farming. There is crop farming, there's livestock farming, there's it's a huge area. Okay, Mika.
Yes, I just wanted to add to it's just similar, most just like my colleague mentioned. Farming is not just farming, but farming and other land use activities plus forestry activities are a major reason why climate change. In fact, if you observe many countries, including India, farming or outflow activities are the major contributor to emissions in the world, greenhouse emissions. So it's more of a problem to climate change than to a solution. But there are certain countries which have adapted, they have adopted some mitigations to it, like climate smart agriculture, which I will be writing on as a policy in Nigeria as well. Nigeria and Ghana and other countries have adopted this as a policy to see how they can fight climate change in as much as improve upon food security and all that. But if you say that agriculture can be used to mitigate the emissions and all that, it may be possible, but it has a minute effect as compared to the problems it can create, because cutting down of trees, burning, and all that contributes so much to emissions than saving it. But when it comes to India, one peculiar thing I found out in the report was that they indicated they wanted to have low carbon economy, and I see that it is an ambition. It is something they want, but how are they going to achieve it? For me, there are some cons there, because there is, due to large population increase, rapid urbanization, and even energy access may be a problem to achieving this particular dream because of the growth in population rate. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's funny you say that, because UK has 1% emission given its population. India only has 7% emission given its population. The sizes are large. So it's not as such the population, it's about the consumption and production. Yeah, even a small population, if it is very affluent, will be able to consume and produce more. That's often what developed countries talk about, saying, oh, large populations means large, but then that's not what, how the correlation works. But definitely there's more consumption, more production. But I agree in terms of India's, NDC, the emission reduction being ambitious. It should be ambitious, but it's a question of, are they able to achieve it? What I will look at more is, what is the projection of their growth rate? Yeah, if they grow, when I say growth rate, I mean the economic growth rate, right? So if they say that they're going to grow hugely, and they have to grow, okay, they do have a very fast growth rate. They have a high growth rate in the world, and that's required for sustainable development goal, because that's how, India also has, I think, the world's either the second largest poor or the largest poor. I think it's usually a competition between Nigeria and India in terms of who houses the maximum number of people below poverty line, so extreme poverty. So if they have to try and better the situation of that, then they need economic growth. But if they have economic growth, then how are they going to meet the challenge of emissions reduction? Because we know economic growth model is production consumption. Then you have to look further into what is the economic growth model. Okay, so let's say that they are growing because they have more renewable energy projects that they come. So there's more jobs, there's more energy that comes around for businesses. So there's more growth in business and all of the knock-on effects. Then in that case, what are the side effects of energy consumption or renewable energy? I think we discussed earlier saying there is environmental degradation caused from mining of materials that contribute towards renewable energy raw material, which is, not raw material, but the technology itself. The solar panels need materials which then cause degradation. So where are they sourcing it from? How are they sourcing it? So you've got to go, that chain of impact needs to be looked at as well. So that's why having a 2.5-page document is quite interesting. It's not the best, isn't it? Right, hold those thoughts. We may be running out of time. I might have to carry over a few of the topics from the lecture later on. Or what I'm going to do is try and complete this. Give me another 5 minutes. Are you guys okay if I complete the slides? I've got a few more slides. We'll come out of the discussion. We'll find another opportunity to come back to this. This was to warm you up to look at some primary documents. Is everyone okay if I continue and finish the slide?
Of course.
Okay, great. So yeah, I'm going to whiz through this, but that will help me cover all of the items on my lecture structure. So right. We saw the documents being of different lengths, yeah, but we also have looked at some of the details. Perhaps one of the reasons is because the CTU obligation really only kicks in legally from the second NDC onwards. Okay, so that's why you also find the level of detail being meager in some of them, and some of them have gone overboard. I didn't look at Pakistan's before, but having looked at it now, that does look like quite a lot. So it doesn't. I wouldn't say a 2-page obligation. Sorry, a 2-page NDC will satisfy a CTU, especially for the sort of policies required. If Vatican had a 2-page, because the number of policies it requires is, not as much, I guess it's justified, but for some countries, I don't see it as being justified. However, legally speaking, they were in all right to do that in the first NDC. For the second NDC, we're going to look for much more. What kind of approach should they really be taking as they go forward? There's two key things to point out over here. One is called the no regrets approach, meaning that you take into account various uncertainties, political uncertainty, the uncertainty with the risk of fruition of climate change. So there are a lot of uncertainties, but you take that. So there's various levels of types of modeling that can be done. You take all of that into account. You basically plan for the worst, so you'll have no regrets. Okay, so that's definitely an approach that is worth taking. Yeah, SDG alignment. So looking at how to achieve SDGs, we've already hit that when we said poverty or food security. Yeah. So these are all goals there in the SDG. So while trying to achieve Paris, you also try and look at what you're doing to achieve SDG, and maybe both of them can complement each other. From a legal point of view, though, SDGs is not a legal framework. Paris Agreement is a legal framework. By aligning that, there may be a legality creep. It's a question for further analysis. How can NDCs be better, but not just the presentation of it, it's more the substance of it. So there is, how can you enhance NDC? So we said going forward, they'll have to present the next round, and the ambitions have to go up. It has to be ratcheted up. So you have to enhance NDCs. There's actually many models out there. This is just one example I've taken from one piece of research on, moving from integrated to integrative. More details about what that means is there in the slide, but also you could refer to that paper. But I mean, what I am quite interested in is what impact is this having from the perspective of development of law and the rule of law with respect to addressing climate change. So we initially talked about this managerial approach as being a feature of the UN climate regime, and also then climate change law as it is developing. So here's another view. I'm increasingly beginning to like this view because it helps me understand it from the perspective of law, and therefore I can apply the usual methods of analysis I do for law. So what I see is actually happening now is that there is the development of global administrative law. And we all are familiar with administrative law. It's an area of public law, which is a part and parcel of every sovereign state progressing its laws, especially how its executive looks at laws, applies the laws, and what sort of outcomes come. So that's sort of the general body of administrative law. But what we're talking about over here, is a very new emerging area of international law, which can be called the global administrative law. There's been some research that's gone on in this. So what is GAL? It's an emerging field that is based upon dual insight. Firstly, that much of what we call now as global governance can be accurately characterized as administrative action. We might say global governance, we might say policy, politics, all of that. But in fact, through the SDG, through the climate regime, it comes to more administrative action because everyone is spending a lot of energy chipping away at how you present things, what you present. But at the end of the day, the governance is about how do you achieve Article 2. Maybe what we're doing is we are losing sight of that, and we might be focusing so much on these gains of administrative actions. Have we, upped the ambition on paper here? Have we got a policy for this? But what are the barriers for implementation? Is there enough finance? Is climate change actually causing, the risks are taking shape in reality much faster? What do we do about that? So maybe those sort of things we need to focus on more. And we'll do that if we focus more on what is really governance, as opposed to allowing administration to masquerade as governance, right? But yes, so GAL, much of what we call as global governance is really, truly, from a legal sense, administrative law. Then increasingly, such action is itself being regulated by principles that we classify as administrative law type of principles. By that, we mean participation, transparency, accountability, review. Now you can see how all of what we would consider as administrative law principles are forming a huge part of what we've talked about as the obligation under NDC. So maybe this obligation of obligation to of conduct is really conduct in terms of compliance with administrative rules, and we really need to move towards obligation of result, right? But that's a speak that then needs to be set in law. Essentially, enforce Article 2. Enforce, get there. Okay, it's as simple as that. Don't say that you've achieved something because you've put in place fabulous administrative rules. So maybe it's a criticism then of the managerial approach in the UN climate regime, and that needs to be addressed. And this is a criticism over and above, saying, okay, we've done well in terms of, having submitted NDCs, but don't lose sight of the important governance aspects that are required. Okay, so the next topic on the lecture was the first global stocktake. It was completed in December 2023. I've put a link to the global stocktake process, the documents that were submitted to the UN FCCC Secretariat. So this was the action that was taken under Article 14, Assessment of Global Climate Action. What did they do? They looked at NDCs and all the documents submitted as part of that. So a lot of policies and a lot of other documents to evidence the NDCs went, and that was a corpus of 1,600 documents from diverse sources. Then the whole process of consultation with scientists, with the governments that submitted these, but also sub-national level, cities and non-state actors, businesses, farmers, indigenous people, civil society, not an exhaustive list. There's lots of others that were considered as being part of those who have a stake in the process. And then the synthesis report that was presented from it. So this was the run-up to the UAE consensus and the actions that we saw that came out of a result of having considered the synthesis report, which is the end product of the global stocktake. So this is what we can expect to come around every 5 years. Okay. So if you are thinking of seriously working in the area of climate change law or climate change policy and governance, then these are things that you need to note. Where do you want to develop your expertise in? Where do you want to intervene? Where do you want to work? What aspect of work that you want to do? Okay, so unpacking the global stocktake, what did happen? Yeah, what kind of a massive undertaking is this? If you break it down, it's a bit like, you writing your essay as well. It's the process has to be as simple as that. But because of the size of it, okay, there are a lot of risks in getting it done well, getting it done on time, getting it done in a way that it makes sense to give us a full assessment. Because there's one thing about stock taking, but another thing is it needs to give us results such that we know what action to take next. So there's data collection, preparation, technical assessment, the consideration of outputs. And then on the right over here, you've got the timeline, which is, when it basically started, when it concluded, what particular actions, how long it took. So you can imagine what kind of an exercise this actually is. So what were the results of the 2023, the first ever global stocktake? I'm afraid not very bright. We all talked about ambition and ambitious NDCs, but look at where we are. The synthesis report underscores a persistent emissions gap. What is the emissions gap? Meaning where we should be and where we are. Meaning that the emissions is still high, way higher than where we would like it to be. So current climate targets are not in line. So current climate commitments are not in line with pathways needed to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that's quite damning and clear. We may have a 3-page NDC, we may have a 76-page NDC, we might have anything in between. But all of that put together, which is the current climate commitments, have not put us on that trajectory. So this is what we looked at in that global thermometer, saying the trajectory of the current policies, where is it taking us to? Probably 2.7. Okay, so that's the one that we need to. But if we didn't have all of this, what did we say? We were going to up to 4. So that seems to be what the Paris Agreement seems to have worked, but then the global stocktake is still, again, it's not enough. Just remember, if there's a well and you have to cross the well, you have to cross it completely. There's no point in saying I've crossed it 3/4. You're still going to fall in, right? So important that we simply cannot take the eye off the ball. System-wide transformations that can slash emissions and ensure a climate resilient future. System-wide transformation, that is very scary, very difficult. Can we stop eating? Can we change our system so that our agriculture system becomes defunct? I mean, that's a very radical way of thinking about it, but that's what it is, system-wide transformation. I was talking about production and consumption. Can we stop producing as much as we do? Can we stop consuming as much as we do? Because both are obviously linked. So how are we going to assess that? It's not about saying, maybe it's not even about saying, let us, move from fossil fuel energy to renewable energy. Like we said, if we keep on increasing our energy use, then we are going to need way more raw material to build our wind turbines, which is going to cause emissions a lot more. Maybe the energy that comes from wind doesn't cost, but your technology is going to cost. So what is the only way to do that? We need to reduce consumption. We need to reduce production. But what happens then to our world economic system, which is based on production, on capital? So most pressing need is to phase out unabated fossil fuels. So this was in the synthesis report. We saw how that was reflected as an element in the UAE consensus. But we also looked at what comments was given to the consensus. They said transition away from fossil fuels was a statement which was ridden with loopholes. That's because we said natural gas is being included as part of the transition fuel. So we saw some comments about how we see the translation from the synthesis report to the political process and the adoption of the next steps after the global stocktake. So maybe we need to improve those processes as well. All of this will, as lawyers, you need to look at, hey, there's no compliance here. How are we going to enforce this? We'll go to court, but which court do we go to? That brings me to the first point that I made. Why did I start this lecture with talking about the International Court of Justice? Right? Maybe we look at a second case to say what's going on, but maybe is that the right forum? Those of you who are studying dispute resolution, how do we identify which is the proper court to go to? Which place do we go? What about a Paris Agreement mechanism itself? We talked about compliance mechanism. Yeah, we talked about Article 16. So how are we going to set up compliance? Or maybe, since we're talking about administrative law and we're talking about a breach of administrative law, how about using national municipal courts to say, well, UK has not, fulfilled its NDC. Maybe we don't have an international forum, but what? In fact, when we come to the section on climate litigation, we will see how municipal processes have been used in forcing enforcement. But lots of problems there as well, as you can expect. Otherwise, we would have seen dazzling results. If the court had been able to give some impressive judgments and the governments were made to act or policies were implemented, then we would start seeing very different results. But you can see that there are issues there as well. Anyway, so moving on to the fifth point, scalable renewable energy significantly shift transport and industry, reduce non-CO2 emissions such as methane, another global greenhouse gas, because the impact of methane on global warming is way, way, way more than carbon. As in 1 unit of methane, 1 unit of carbon dioxide, the huge difference. So in a way, if you can reduce methane more, and by the way, agriculture, there's a lot of methane that comes out from agriculture. So it's one of the culprits. So reduce non-CO2 emissions such as methane. So there's some very specific directions, picking out one gas, picking out certain sectors of the economy all mentioned in the synthesis report. Preserving nature, ending deforestation, embracing sustainable agriculture, all also key to enhance resilience and deliver emission cuts. So those of you who look at agriculture as part of the solution, what does sustainable agriculture look like? Embracing sustainable agriculture. So if you're really interested in that topic, go and do more research on how agriculture can be part of the solution. Yeah, there were some things I read about a solar farm, for example, having solar panels on the top and then you're growing crops below, even crops that are cattle fodder, for example. So there's hundreds and thousands of ideas out there actually. And all of them, many of them you can find even on the UNFCCC's website. You need to go and scour a lot of them. Okay, in the interest of time, let me just bulldoze on. The last topic on the lecture was LTLEDS, which means long-term low emission development strategy. That's LELTDS. One key question from a legal point of view is, does the global stocktake also look at LTLTDS ambition and LTLDDS policies? The answer is no. But what it does do is the LTLEDS becomes an instrument to frame the international conversations, the international negotiations, for example, in the context of global stocktake, but that only takes place every 5 years. So it'll also be in every year, the annual COP, around the needs of countries consistently with a bottom-up paradigm introduced by the Paris Agreement. So what are we saying all through over here? We cannot do it if countries don't come up with it themselves. So not only do they come up with their NDCs, but also they come up with the long-term plans, because sometimes they will have benefits from the long-term plans if, they can politically convince, saying we do this now so that our long-term economic growth is better. So that's the whole argument around sustainable development. Okay, I did race along, but sorry for having taken up your time beyond the class. I know all of you are sitting past 9 o'clock, so let me stop there. And if there are any questions, quickly I can answer them. Otherwise, we'll see you. Is it next week?
Yes, Professor, next week.
Next week, yes, yeah. Okay, all done. You have no questions, you're free to go and enjoy the rest of the week.
Goodbye. Thank you very much.
All right,
Thank you
take
very
care.
much.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.